Valentina had always known her grandfather was sharper than people gave him credit for. Roberto was 83 years old and had spent 60 of those years running a small construction business that had built half the commercial properties in their county. He had built that business with his hands and his mind and the specific discipline of a man who had never had the luxury of being careless with money or with people. His family had stopped seeing that, not all of them. Valentina had never stopped seeing it, but her parents, Roberto's son and daughter-in-law, had spent the past 4 years operating on the assumption that Roberto's age meant his awareness had diminished. They had made financial decisions that weren't theirs to make. They had signed documents on his behalf that he had not authorized. They had redirected income from a rental property Roberto owned into an account they managed and had described the arrangement to Roberto as administrative convenience. Roberto had not said anything about this for 4 years. He had been documenting it instead. In a metal box he had placed under a loose floorboard in his workshop. A box that Valentina had known about since she was 11 years old because Roberto had shown her where it was and had told her that it was where he kept the things that mattered most and that she was the person he trusted to find it when the time came. The time had come. And what was in that box had been the most organized and most devastating piece of documentation Valentina had ever held in her hands. Before that metal box comes out from under the floorboard and Valentina opens it and sees what 4 years of quiet documentation looks like, hit subscribe right now. Because the moment Roberto speaks at that family meeting and describes every unauthorized action from his own memory, and the attorney places the box documentation beside his words, is one of the most quietly powerful moments in this entire story. New videos every single week. Hit like if you have ever underestimated someone older and been completely wrong. Drop a comment. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved had been protecting themselves quietly for years? Now let's go back to Sacramento, because Roberto is lifting the floorboard, and Valentina is about to understand everything. My name is Valentina. I am 28 years old and I live in Sacramento, California. My grandfather Roberto has been the most significant person in my life for as long as I can remember, not in the loud, dramatic way of people who filled rooms with their presence, but in the specific, quiet way of a man who had built everything he had with his own hands and had never needed to announce it. He had run a small construction company for 60 years, had started it at 23 with 1 truck and 2 employees, and had built it into something that had constructed half the commercial properties in our county before he had retired at 80 and had turned the operations over to a manager he trusted. He was 83 now. He lived alone in the house he had built himself in 1974. And he was, by every measure that actually mattered, the sharpest person I knew. Roberto had grown up without much, had told Valentina the stories of his early years in the specific matter-of-fact way he told all stories, without embellishment or self-pity, just the facts of what had been and what he had done about them. He had learned construction from his own father, had saved money from his first job for 3 years before he had enough to start the business, had built his first commercial contract through a cold introduction to a developer who had taken a chance on a young contractor with good references and a clean bid. He had built from there, one contract, one reputation, one relationship at a time, over 60 years of work that had left its mark on the physical landscape of the county, in the form of buildings that were still standing and still occupied and still sound, because Roberto had never cut a corner that wasn't his to cut. Marco was Roberto's only son, Valentina's father, 56 years old, who had grown up watching Roberto build the business and had chosen a different path through no particular conflict, had simply been drawn toward sales rather than construction, and had built a career in that direction. He had been attentive to Roberto in the normal ways of a son with an aging parent, visiting regularly, handling the things that Roberto asked him to handle, being present at the medical appointments that had become more frequent in Roberto's 80s. The shift had been gradual. At some point in the past 4 years, the handling of things Roberto asked for had expanded to include the handling of things Roberto had not asked for, financial decisions made on his behalf, documents processed under his name, arrangements described as administrative conveniences that Roberto had not specifically authorized. Valentina had noticed the pattern over 2 years of Sunday visits, had noticed it in the specific way that came from paying attention rather than from any particular suspicion. She had noticed that the conversation about Roberto's rental property, a small commercial building he had owned for 30 years, and that generated consistent monthly income, had changed in character. Roberto had stopped mentioning the income directly. When Valentina had asked about it, once Roberto had said Marco handled the deposits now, that it was easier that way. She had noticed documents on Roberto's kitchen table that carried the formal look of legal or financial instruments, and that were sometimes already signed when she arrived for her visit. She had noticed that Roberto occasionally referred to financial decisions that she was certain he had not been consulted on in any meaningful way. She had noticed and had filed it and had waited. Roberto had not raised the financial situation with Valentina in all the Sunday visits of the past 2 years, had been warm and present and entirely himself, had asked real questions about her work and her life, had told the construction stories she had been hearing since childhood, and that she never tired of, because each telling surfaced a detail she hadn't noticed in the previous one. But he had not spoken about Marco or the finances or the documents on the kitchen table. Valentina had respected that silence, had understood intuitively that Roberto was a man who moved at his own pace toward things that mattered, and that pressing him toward a conversation he wasn't ready to have would produce nothing useful. She had waited. She visited every Sunday. She had paid attention. And she had trusted that when Roberto was ready he would tell her. The Sunday had been in October, a visit that had begun exactly like the ones before it. The coffee Roberto made strong the way he always made it. The conversation that moved through the week's events, and the construction news Roberto still followed with the attentiveness of a man who never fully retired from something he had built with his own hands. Her parents had visited first, had stayed 90 minutes, and had left with the easy warmth of people who believed the Sunday was proceeding normally. Roberto had seen them to the door and had come back to the kitchen and had sat across from Valentina and had looked at her for a moment in the specific way he looked at things he was assessing carefully. He had said, "Stay a little longer. I have something to show you." He had said it quietly and with the particular weight of a man who had been waiting to say it for a long time. He had taken her to the workshop after dark, the separate building at the back of the property, where he had spent most of his working life, and that still smelled of sawdust and machine oil, and the specific combination of materials that Valentina had associated with Roberto since she was small. He had walked to the far corner without turning on the overhead light, had used the work lamp on the bench, which cast a specific warm directional light that he had always preferred for detailed work. He had moved a workbench that appeared stationary but moved on wheels he had installed himself, and beneath it was a section of flooring that lifted cleanly when he found the specific board. The metal box was below it, gray, latched, exactly where he had placed it. He had lifted it out and had placed it on the workbench and had looked at Valentina. He had said, "I showed you this when you were 11. I told you it was for the things that mattered most." He had said, "It is time." Valentina had opened the box with Roberto beside her, standing at the workbench under the specific warm light of the work lamp, the October evening quiet outside the workshop windows. The latch had been stiff in the way of metal that had been closed for a long time without being opened. Roberto had shown her how to work it when she was 11, and her hands had remembered. Inside the box, the contents were organized with the precision she recognized immediately as Roberto's, the same precision he had brought to construction bids and project timelines for 60 years, the specific neatness of a man who understood that accurate documentation was the difference between a job that held and a job that failed. Each section was separated by a labeled divider. Each document was in a plastic sleeve. She had looked at the organization before she had looked at the contents, and had understood that what was inside had been built carefully over time. The first section had been the rental property documentation, Roberto's commercial building, the one he had owned for 30 years, and that had generated consistent monthly income throughout. He had preserved the original bank statements showing the deposit account where the rental income had been directed for decades, his own account, his name, the same account he had managed since the business was active. Beside the original statements, he had placed a series of more recent statements showing the same rental income arriving in a different account, an account that carried Marco's name as the primary account holder. The transition had happened 26 months ago. Roberto had the bank documentation showing the account change request, which had been submitted with his signature on a document he had placed in the section with a handwritten note attached. The note said, "I did not sign this." The second section had been the most methodically organized, a series of document copies, each one placed beside a corresponding entry from Roberto's personal calendar. The documents were financial and legal instruments, account modifications, a property management authorization, a banking power of attorney that Roberto had placed in the section with particular emphasis, paper clipped to the front. Each document carried a signature in Roberto's name. Each calendar entry beside it showed where Roberto had actually been on the date the document had been signed: a medical appointment, a lunch with his accountant, a Tuesday afternoon Valentina recognized from her own records as a Sunday visit she had made. The calendar entries were in Roberto's handwriting. The document dates and the calendar entries did not align on a single page of the section. The third section contained the ledger, a standard construction accounting notebook of the kind Roberto had used throughout his working life, its cover worn at the corners in the way of something handled regularly. Inside, he had recorded every transaction he had identified as unauthorized: date, amount, description, the account it had moved through, and a brief notation in his precise, compressed handwriting describing how he had identified it. The entries began 26 months ago and continued to 3 weeks before the Sunday he had shown Valentina the box. There were 47 entries. Some were small amounts that individually might have been explained as administrative errors. Laid out in sequence across 26 months, they were not administrative errors. They were a pattern that Roberto had been reading accurately and recording specifically from the first entry to the last. The fourth section had surprised Valentina most, not because its existence was inconsistent with Roberto's character, but because of the specific effort it represented. Roberto had obtained signed and dated witness statements from 3 people: his neighbor of 22 years, a woman named Gloria who had observed specific interactions between Roberto and Marco on dates Roberto had noted in the ledger. His other neighbor, a retired contractor named Bill who had known Roberto for 30 years and had been present on one occasion when a document had been brought to Roberto's house for signature, and had observed what had happened. And Roberto's accountant of 18 years, a man named Frank who had prepared a formal statement describing a conversation in which Marco had asked him to redirect the rental income reporting in a way Frank had declined and had documented at the time. Each statement was signed, each was dated, each described specific observations rather than general impressions. The fifth section was Roberto's own written statement, 12 pages in the composition notebook he had used, his handwriting steady and specific across every page. He had written it the way he had built things, from the foundation up, in sequence, without skipping steps. He had begun with the first unauthorized action 26 months ago, and had described every subsequent event in the order it had occurred, with dates and amounts, and the specific words he remembered being said on each occasion. He had described the conversations in which the arrangements had been presented to him as administrative conveniences. He had described what he had understood those conversations to mean, and what the documentation had subsequently revealed they had actually meant. He had written it without anger and without self-pity, in the same matter-of-fact register he used for everything, the tone of a man recording facts accurately because accurate facts were what the situation required. At the bottom of the box, beneath all the organized sections, placed there deliberately as the last thing rather than the first, was a sealed envelope with Valentina's name on the front in Roberto's handwriting. She had looked at it for a moment before opening it. It was dated 3 months before the Sunday he had shown her the box. Inside was a single page, not the formal documentation language of the rest of the box, but Roberto's own voice, speaking directly to her. He had written that he had chosen her because she had always listened and had never needed him to be less than he was. He had written that he had not said anything out loud because he had needed to build the record before anything was said, that words without documentation were just words, and that documentation without the right person to act on it was just paper. He had written, "You are the right person. I have always known that. Now it is time." Valentina had read the entire box in the workshop that Sunday evening, had gone through every section, with the focused attention of someone who understood that she needed to know the material completely before she acted on it. Roberto had sat beside her on the old wooden stool he kept at the workbench, the same stool she had sat on as a child watching him work, and had answered her questions as she read. She had asked about specific entries in the ledger, and he had elaborated without consulting the notes because the entries were things he remembered precisely. She had asked about the calendar documentation, and he had explained his system, had been keeping the calendar the same way for 40 years, daily entries, never missed. She had finished reading at 10:30. She had driven home with the box on her passenger seat and had not slept much. She had called the elder law attorney's office at 8:52 Monday morning, had found the name through the same regional referral service she had heard mentioned in a professional context, and had noted for future reference without anticipating she would need it. The assistant had answered, and Valentina had explained the situation in 2 sentences. Her 83-year-old grandfather, 4 years of documented financial exploitation, a metal box with organized evidence she needed a professional to review. The assistant had put her on hold for 40 seconds and had come back with an appointment for Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. Valentina had confirmed it and had spent the rest of Monday photographing every document in the box as a backup to the originals and organizing the photographs in a dated folder on her secure cloud storage. The attorney was a woman named Margaret Osei, who had practiced elder law for 19 years and who had reviewed the box documentation with the focused efficiency of someone who had seen enough cases to assess the weight of evidence quickly and accurately. She had gone through each section in sequence, had asked Valentina 3 clarifying questions during the rental income section, had been completely silent during the ledger review, had read 2 of the witness statements in full and the others in summary. When she finished, she had set the last document down and had looked at Valentina across the conference table. She had said, "In 19 years, this is among the most thoroughly documented cases of elder financial exploitation I have reviewed." She had said it without drama. She had said it as an accurate professional assessment. Valentina had said, "My grandfather built it." Margaret had said, "I can tell." Margaret had asked to meet Roberto the following week, had said his direct participation was important both for the legal process and for ensuring that the proceedings reflected his own wishes rather than anyone else's assessment of what those wishes should be. Roberto had come to her office on a Thursday morning, had driven himself, which Valentina had offered to prevent, and Roberto had declined with the specific courtesy of a man who understood the offer and was not going to accept it. Margaret had spent 90 minutes with him, had assessed his cognitive capacity formally as part of the meeting, had asked him detailed questions about the box's contents that he had answered from memory without reference to any document. She had told Valentina afterward that Roberto was one of the sharpest 83-year-olds she had encountered in her practice. Valentina had said she knew. Margaret had filed on 2 tracks simultaneously: a formal complaint with the County Adult Protective Services Office and the initiation of civil proceedings against Marco and his wife for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She had explained to Valentina and Roberto that the 2 tracks served different purposes. The APS complaint created a formal protective record and triggered an independent investigation, while the civil proceedings addressed the financial remedies directly. She had said the documentation Roberto had assembled supported both tracks comprehensively. She had said that in her experience, cases with this level of documentation moved more efficiently through both systems than cases that relied primarily on testimony, that the paper trail Roberto had built was doing work that years of verbal accounts often failed to accomplish. Marco had called Valentina at 6:14 on a Thursday evening, 2 days after the legal documents had been served. She had been expecting the call and had decided in advance how she was going to receive it. He had said her name when she answered, had said it with the specific energy of a man who was managing several things simultaneously and had not yet settled on which one was most urgent. He had said he had received some documents and that he needed to understand what was happening. He had asked if she knew about them. Valentina had said yes. He had asked how she was involved. Valentina had said Roberto had shown her the box himself and that everything in it had been reviewed by an elder law attorney who was now representing Roberto's interests formally. Her dad had been quiet for a moment. Then he asked what box. She had told him clearly and without elaboration. The metal box under the floorboard in the workshop, the one Roberto had maintained for 4 years, the one that contained 47 ledger entries and bank statements and document copies, and 3 witness statements in Roberto's own 12-page written account. She had said Roberto had shown it to her himself on a Sunday evening 6 weeks ago, and that she had taken it to Margaret Osei the following Tuesday. She had said the documentation was comprehensive and had been assessed as such by a professional with 19 years of relevant experience. She had said Roberto was cognitively sharp and had been formally assessed as fully capable of directing his own affairs and the legal proceedings that were now underway. She had said, "He built that box himself, Dad, every page of it for 4 years." She had said it without anger. She had let the information be what it was. Margaret had recommended the family meeting be held at her office rather than at a neutral venue. Had explained to Valentina that her conference room carried the specific weight of a legal setting that she had found productive in situations where one party had been operating on the assumption that family dynamics would soften accountability. She had said the setting communicated something important before anyone spoke, that this was a formal proceeding with professional oversight rather than a family conversation that could be redirected or managed through the social tools that family conversations were susceptible to. Valentina had agreed without needing to think about it. The meeting had been scheduled for a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the legal proceedings had been initiated. Roberto had confirmed his attendance without asking whether he needed to be there. He had said, "Of course I will be there. It is my situation." Margaret's conference room had a long table, Roberto and Valentina on one side, Margaret beside them, her parents and their attorney on the other. Marco had arrived with his wife Alina, and a man named Peter Strand, who had been retained as their legal representative, a corporate attorney rather than an elder law specialist, which Margaret had noted to Valentina beforehand as a choice that communicated something about how Marco had initially framed the situation to himself. Roberto had arrived first, had been seated and composed when the others came in, his hands flat on the table in the specific still way he had always held himself when he was paying full attention. He had nodded at Marco when Marco entered. Marco had said good morning in the careful register of a man who was uncertain of his reception and was managing his presentation accordingly. Margaret had opened the meeting with the documentation, had placed organized copies in front of each party, and had walked through the material in the same sequence. Valentina had read it in the workshop, section by section. The rental income redirection first, the original account, the changed account, the account change request document bearing a signature Roberto had not made. The calendar documentation second, the instruments dated against the entries that placed Roberto elsewhere on each signing date. The ledger third, 47 entries across 26 months, each one specific and sourced. The witness statements fourth, Gloria, Bill, Frank, each statement read in summary with the signed originals available for review. Roberto's written account fifth, Margaret had read 3 passages from it directly, in Roberto's own words, which had produced a specific quality of silence in the room. Peter Strand had presented his client's position with the practiced fluency of a corporate attorney, adapting his standard tools to an unfamiliar context, competently, but without the specific knowledge base that elder law proceedings required. He had argued that the financial arrangements had been made in Roberto's best interest, and with his implied consent, that Marco and Alina had been acting as caregivers, managing complex affairs on behalf of an aging family member, and that the arrangements had been practical rather than exploitative. He had used the phrase implied consent 3 times. Margaret had let him finish and had then placed the document copy from the box. The banking power of attorney bearing Roberto's signature on a date his calendar placed him at a medical appointment, directly in the center of the table. She had said, "Please show me where the consent is documented." Roberto had not spoken during the documentation presentation or during Peter's argument, had sat with his hands flat on the table and his attention completely present in the room. When Margaret indicated that he was welcome to speak if he wished, he had straightened slightly, the specific adjustment of a man who had spent 60 years speaking at meetings where what he said mattered and who understood what that required. He spoke for 22 minutes. He had described each unauthorized action from his own direct knowledge, had named the date, the amount, the document, the conversation in which the arrangement had been presented to him. He had not read from notes. He had not referenced the box. He had spoken from memory because the events were his, and he remembered them precisely, and had been remembering them for 4 years. When Roberto finished speaking, Margaret had placed the box documentation beside his verbal account, had opened the relevant section for each event Roberto had described, and had shown the room that the documentation confirmed every specific detail he had named. The date Roberto had given for the rental income redirection was the date on the bank record. The amount he had cited for the first ledger entry was the amount in the ledger. The conversation he had described with Frank the accountant was the conversation documented in Frank's witness statement. Every event Roberto had described from memory existed in the box with a date, a source, and in most cases an independent corroboration. Peter Strand had looked at the parallel documentation for a long time without speaking. Marco had his hands in his lap. Alina was looking at the surface of the conference table. Margaret had closed the presentation by placing the full picture on the table, a single summary page she had prepared that laid out the total financial impact of the documented unauthorized actions across 26 months, the redirected rental income, the unauthorized transactions from the ledger, the value of the property management authorization, that had been executed without Roberto's consent. The summary page had a total at the bottom. Margaret had said the civil proceedings were seeking full recovery of that total, plus applicable damages. She had said the APS investigation was proceeding independently on its own track. She had said Roberto had the right to pursue both processes fully, and that the documentation supported him comprehensively on both. She had looked at Peter Strand and had said, "Your clients should understand that this documentation was built over 4 years by the person it was built about. It is complete. There are no gaps." The civil proceedings had produced a settlement 6 weeks after the family meeting. Not because the case had been weak or the documentation insufficient, but because Peter Strand had apparently reviewed the full 112 pages of Roberto's documentation alongside Margaret's legal analysis, and had advised his clients that proceeding to a contested hearing carried risks that the settlement avoided. The settlement terms had been specific and complete. The full amount of the redirected rental income returned to Roberto's account within 30 days, the unauthorized transactions reversed where reversal was possible, and compensated at documented value where it was not, and damages applied at the rate Margaret had calculated based on 19 years of knowing exactly what elder financial exploitation cases warranted. Roberto had reviewed the settlement document with Margaret and had signed it with his own hand. The settlement had been followed immediately by the restructuring of Roberto's financial management, an arrangement Margaret had prepared and that Roberto had reviewed and approved with the same thoroughness he had brought to the box. Valentina had been appointed as Roberto's financial advocate through a properly structured legal instrument, not a guardianship, which Roberto had not needed and had not wanted, but a formal advocacy arrangement that gave Valentina legal standing to monitor, review, and if necessary challenge any financial decision affecting Roberto's accounts or assets. A transparent accounting system had been established, monthly statements reviewed by both Roberto and Valentina, all transactions above a specified threshold requiring documented authorization in Roberto's own hand. Margaret had said it was the right structure for a man who was fully capable of managing his own affairs and simply needed someone trustworthy in his corner. Marco and Alina's access to Roberto's financial affairs had been formally terminated as part of the settlement, documented in the agreement, legally binding, enforceable through the court's oversight of the settlement terms. Margaret had explained to Valentina that formal termination was more protective than informal distance, that a legal instrument closing the access was more difficult to gradually reopen than a family understanding that could be eroded through the ordinary pressures of family dynamics over time. Roberto had understood this and had agreed to it without apparent emotion, had received it the way he received most things that were accurate and necessary, as information that required action rather than feeling. He had said it should have been this way from the beginning. Margaret had said, yes, it should have. Roberto had continued living independently in the house he had built in 1974, the same house, the same workshop, the same morning routine of coffee and the construction news he still followed, and the garden that had been his project since he retired. Nothing about his daily life had changed in the ways that mattered. He was in his own home, managing his own mornings, cooking his own meals, and receiving visitors on his own terms. What had changed was the specific quality of the space, the particular lightness that arrived in a place when something that had been wrong in it had been corrected. Valentina had noticed it on her first Sunday visit after the settlement. The house felt like Roberto's house in a way it had not fully felt for 4 years. She had not said this to him. She had simply noted it and was glad. The Sunday visits had continued exactly as they always had, the coffee Roberto made strong, the conversation that moved through the week's news, and the construction industry developments he still followed with genuine interest, the stories she had been hearing since childhood that continued to surface new details. The visits were the same and also different in the specific way that things were different when a weight had been lifted from them, not transformed, just freed to be what they had always been without the particular shadow that had been present for 4 years. Roberto had not spoken about Marco, or the proceedings, or the settlement during the Sunday visits. He had spoken about the garden, the news, the project he had mentioned wanting to start when the weather was right. Valentina had matched his register. Visits had been exactly right. 6 months after the settlement, Roberto had shown Valentina something in the workshop, a small wooden cabinet he had been building, the first construction project he had undertaken in 2 years. He had shown it to her with the specific quiet pride of a man whose hands had made something and who wanted someone he trusted to see it. The cabinet was precise and clean, the joints fitted with the accuracy that 60 years of construction had produced in his hands. He had explained the joinery to her the way he had always explained his work, step by step, the reasoning behind each decision, the way each choice connected to the ones before and after it. She had asked real questions and he had answered them completely. The workshop had smelled of sawdust and wood oil. The workbench had been clear. The floorboard in the corner was still loose. Valentina had driven home after that Sunday visit through the Sacramento evening with the particular settled feeling of someone who had done the right thing at the right time and was now simply living in the world that the right thing had made possible. She had thought about the 11-year-old girl who had been brought to a workshop by a man she loved and had been shown a floorboard and told that it was where he kept the things that mattered most and that she was the person he trusted to find them when the time came. She had been 11 and had not fully understood what he was telling her. She understood it now completely, that Roberto had been building trust the same way he built everything, carefully and over time, and with the specific intention of a man who knew that the things worth building required the right foundation. He had chosen her as his foundation 17 years ago. She had driven home through the Sacramento evening and had thought, I hope I was worth it. Then she had thought about the cabinet in the workshop and his hands on the joinery, and the way he had explained each decision to her, and she had understood that he had already answered that question. She had been worth it. He had shown her that in the workshop 6 months after the settlement with the same quiet certainty, he had shown her everything that mattered, without announcement, without drama, just by being exactly who he had always been.